Well, the big global story, and we are, of course, reacting to it here in India, as is the global market at this point in time. US President Donald Trump unleashing a barrage of tariffs to match duties put on US goods by other countries. Now, a 10% baseline tariff on all imports to the US will come into effect from the 5th of April, and higher duties on some countries, which are the US's biggest trading partners, will come into effect from the 9th of April. To help us make sense of the impact and the implications of the Trump tariffs, what this means for the US, what it means for the global economy, and more importantly, what it means for India and how India should respond. Joining us now is Jaimini Bhagwati, Distinguished Fellow at the Center for Social and Economic Progress. He's also the former Indian High Commissioner to the United Kingdom, the former World Bank Treasury in Washington, D.C., and the former Joint Secretary of the Department of Economic Affairs in the Ministry of Finance. Mr. Bhagwati, many thanks for joining us here. I know you don't do TV interviews, but you're making an exception to this morning, because it is a very important morning as we digest what's happened in the US overnight. To start with, your first reactions to the announcements that have come in from the Trump administration, and also this business of these being reciprocal tariffs, because these aren't technically, if you look at the fine print and you look at the math, it's not necessarily a reciprocal tariff in itself.
You're absolutely right. I think it's already been discussed in several quarters that they're looking at exports divided by imports and then divide that by 2 to come up with a tariff rate, which is simplistic to say the least. But let's take a step back. You know, these tariffs are a part of an overall Trump agenda. And this will have consequences in the short, in the medium, and long term around the world. And it will not just be confined to trade, it will be more widespread in terms of foreign direct investment. And then, perhaps even more importantly, strategic issues will be viewed differently. For instance, in the EU, as you know already, the EU is uncomfortable with the US attitude on the Ukraine-Russia war. But today, let us focus more on what has happened yesterday. As far as India is concerned, let's take specifics. Now, India, let's take the global. Why is Trump doing this? What is the basis? I think the US total imports are roughly $3 trillion US. Total, I'm talking about goods. Total exports are about $2 trillion. This is in goods. Now, so they have an adverse balance of trade of about $1 trillion US in goods. In services, the US has a surplus. It exports about $1 trillion worth of services and imports about $700 billion of services. So it has a surplus of 300. If you take both goods and services, it has an adverse balance of trade of 700 billion. Now, the problem is that on the services side, as we all know, the number of people employed is relatively low compared to manufacturing. So he's obviously carrying on with what he said during the campaign, now that he's president, to address those supporters who are very concerned about jobs lost. So that is the US. But similarly, around the world, other countries too have concerns about employment. And so if the US imposes tariffs at a level much higher than before, without getting into the specifics of each country, to that extent, manufacturing in the rest of the world gets affected negatively. Let's take specific US-India. The Indian exports to the US, lamentably, sadly, still the major component is about 12 billion of bedding and clothes, et cetera, et cetera. Another 10 billion is pharmaceutical products. And that, obviously, there must be a lot of concern on that. It's difficult for the US or anyone else, irrespective of what tariffs they put. If they are the same for Bangladesh and others who are our competitors, we may still be able to export. From the US, surprisingly, it is oils and other kinds of products which comprise, which is the highest amount, about 10 billion or so. The next one, hold your breath, is nuclear equipment. So this is an area where we are way short of our targets. So to the extent that we can, if not mollify, do something which is, to use a stock phrase, win-win for the US and India, we can do more on the nuclear front. I'll stop there because I've already spoken long enough.
Well, those are important points that you bring up. So let's continue this conversation on the Indian response. Negotiations are currently underway to ink a bilateral trade agreement with the US. This business of putting things on the table that could possibly mollify the US administration, the Trump administration. You spoke about nuclear equipment. We saw perhaps the moves towards opening that space up in the budget, with the government announcing that it is likely to amend the liability clause that will enable a movement towards more nuclear equipment being facilitated, or at least the import of that being facilitated into India. Oil imports up 67% from the US. That's the latest number. LNG imports, similar story. So do you believe that as India readies its response, where do you believe we should draw the red lines, and what more do you believe we can offer?
Well, the first thing, you referred to the nuclear liability clause in the 2010 legislation, which was very short-sighted. I think the government has the numbers to be, it was all based on the Bhopal gas tragedy, and the people felt that we had not put in enough into our laws to be able to extract commensurate penalties from those who caused harm to our people. So I think that needs to be amended. And to that extent, the US will see that we're actually trying to do something which is of interest to them. So whether it is GE, Westinghouse, etc., you'll be surprised how much the US exports to the EU countries on the nuclear front. People don't talk about it, but it is substantial. So to that extent, I take it that they are competitive, even if we don't give them any preferential access. That said, now coming back to our bilateral front, there's too much has been made about this trade agreement that we'll sign by fall or by December and so on. There is a tremendous resistance over the decades, I've noticed, from our industry to opening up our trade sector in goods. And, they're right. The US is right that we have irresponsibly high trade barriers. For instance, certain kinds of car above a certain engine size, 125% duty. We have only heard of Harley Davidson from him. Why is Indian industry so scared of competition? Or is it that they are so mollycoddled and feel so comfortable? I'm not suggesting that what Trump is doing is reasonable or right or not. But I'm talking about a spin-off benefit that if it forces our industry and manufacturing to be a little more competitive, if not hugely more competitive, it'll be good for you and me, because I'm assuming you're not an industrialist, nor am I. I'm just a consumer of products. And of course, a huge amount of the cost that we have to pay is GST, et cetera, depending on the size of the car. But if the import duties come down, to that extent, we'll be all better off for a range of manufactured products.
Yes, you're right in pointing out that neither of us are business people, and yes, the consumer will eventually benefit if we actually see lower cost imports coming in, which may force Indian industry to be far more competitive as well. But, I also want to understand from you, Mr. Bhagwati, how we should read what is happening within the region. Now, we've already started to see industry reactions coming in saying, look, while there is a cause for concern, but we should also look at the silver lining, which is that China, Vietnam, etc., have been slapped with higher tariffs in comparison to India. Now, do you believe that this kind of response at this point in time is premature? How do you believe this is going to reshape what has been happening in the region when it comes to FDI, when it comes to supply chain resilience?
Highly premature, because it's not just duties. Shereen, I'm sure you will not buy a product that you're not satisfied about just because it's a little cheaper. So in case these duties mean that some manufacturing moves to India, so we need to be careful that we have the robust supply chain in place and so on, which will take time. My guess is in the short term, I think the US and President Trump in particular have been short-sighted in imposing such huge tariffs on ASEAN, the smaller ASEAN countries. They are basically providing relatively labor-intensive products to the US. What is going to happen? Here is where I bring the strategic aspect into play. The ASEAN countries are physically closer to China. They have large volumes of trade with China, but they are strategically closer to the US because they don't want communism to overtake their countries, except for Laos, which has now effectively become a Chinese colony, and Cambodia is also hugely under Chinese influence. But even somewhat larger ASEAN countries like Malaysia, etc., Thailand, they may gravitate towards China in terms of looking for ways in which they can meet market demand in China on some preferential basis. And the Chinese, given the size of their economy, will look to provide some kind of alternative to the US. So that is more likely than India immediately replacing Vietnam or Malaysia or Thailand as a place where manufacturing will quickly shift. It could over time, as we know in the case of Apple. We are now producing Apple phones because that's also somewhat political in terms of the summit level meetings between India and the US. And I don't see that we will become a world leader in terms of a trading nation. If we had that confidence, we would have joined RCEP because we were nervous about our own capabilities, or the CPTPP. I think those are groupings that we should have a fresh look at. We don't have to do it in public view. This can be done quietly by experts within government and also pulling in non-government experts to look at the change scenario. Do we still feel that nervous about these trade blocs as compared to earlier, given the kind of attitude that the US has taken yesterday?
Well, that's an important point that you make, that perhaps one of the unintended consequences of the Trump tariffs could be a shift towards China. You know, through the pandemic, there was a move away from China. Could this move a lot of these smaller ASEAN countries and perhaps large economies as well to re-look or review their engagement with China? That's an important point that you raise as well. But, you know, coming back to FDI, because you said that there is likely to be a question mark now on what happens as far as FDI is concerned. You know, growth projections globally are being cut at this point in time, given the impact of the tariffs, expected impact of the tariffs. On FDI, do you believe that we're going to enter a phase of pause, or do you think that people are going to go ahead with their plans to set up fresh capacities, etc.? I'll also ask you this in the context of the clamor that's already started from trade associations, industry bodies in India saying, look, let's extend the PLI scheme. Let's bring more sectors under the PLI scheme. The PLI schemes that were expected to sunset, those should be granted another 2-3 year extension. Your thoughts on that, Mr. Bhagwati?
You know, the PLI scheme, I have some reservations about it, but this is not the time to discuss that. Some industries and some companies have been favored. I'm not suggesting that there is any corruption involved. I mean, it is the nature of that scheme. I think we need much more than PLI schemes to kickstart or jumpstart several parts of our industry. Manufacturing is still languishing at that same percentage. You know, services keeps increasing as a percentage of our GDP every year, incrementally by 0.2, 0.3, 0.5, while manufacturing somewhere there, depending on how you count, 15, 16, 17. I mean, that is a reflection of the fact that there are serious issues here in terms of manufacturing. And whenever I talk to any major a company which has a very large, should we say, production capability in India, they tell me that our labor is untrainable. Plus, the cost of labor keeps increasing, while mechanization also keeps increasing. So take a company which was producing X units or X widgets 20 years ago. the cost of labor per person was, say, something like 20 or 30,000 rupees. And they used to produce 100 units, out of which most of them had some human input. Now the cost of that same labor, doing the same kind of job, has gone to 60, 70,000 rupees a month, while they have had the benefit of increased mechanization to bring down the workforce by 50%. Now, where are these things being discussed, and how is all this relevant to what Trump has done yesterday? These are underlying weaknesses in our manufacturing, which a PLI can barely scratch the surface of. So we need to think of how and why some of our workers, we are both aware of AI and DeepSeek and ChatGPT and so on. I'm not saying that tomorrow ChatGPT will take over tire production or whatever. The problem is that things are getting increasingly sophisticated, and you know and I know about the Acer tests, how class 8 students don't know as much as what they would be expected to know at class 2 and all that. So there is a short-term solution, there is a medium-term solution, there is a long-term solution. So PLI may help a little bit in the short term. It cannot help even in the medium term. Medium term and long term solutions are different, of which you have discussed a number of times with various finance secretaries and finance ministers.
So, Mr. Bhagwati, before I let you go, you talked about the intended and unintended consequences in the short, medium and long term. Let's address the short term, because, we don't know what may change perhaps as early as tonight or tomorrow morning, and the possibility of that is fairly high given what we've seen through the course of the last 70 days of this administration. In the short term, in the very near term, the consequences of the measures taken by President Trump?
Number one, all investment, whether it is domestic or foreign, fresh investment, unless it is already in the pipeline and you've done 90% of the investment, you'll carry on with the 10% of the investment. All fresh investment will be put on a hold. I can just imagine, I'm on the board of one company, but I've been on boards of other companies. I know how the conversation will go. The risk management chaps will say, hang on, let us wait for the dust to settle. Let us see how things emerge. So if you are planning a 50 million or a 1,000 crore investment over the next 6 months, because all the clearances, everything is through, and you even found or located the piece of land where you will do this, my own guess is that everybody will go into a mode of go slow. Let's watch, which is not good for us. It is not good for the US. It's not good for ASEAN countries. It is not good for anyone. So business must go on. The business of business is 24 hours. That means at some place on earth, it is day and something should happen. And what Trump has done by throwing this spanner into this works of trade is also going to affect investment. I would be very, very surprised if somebody who's thinking of fresh capacity on producing some widget, which may face higher tariffs, and to that extent skew their projections of what their market would be, they'll say, hang on, should we now do it in 2 phases? We were going to produce 1,000 widgets. Let's now think of only 500. So that's the unfortunate thing, to which it means that whatever they were thinking in terms of employing labor, that will also get slowed down. And I am most concerned about underemployment in India. We can't have unemployment, because if you have unemployment, then you are dead. You're starving. So a lot of people are underemployed, and I worry that they may continue to be underemployed. So that is my worry that Mr. Trump has imposed, not just on our country, on around the world, actually.
Yes, a period of uncertainty, volatility, and as we are hearing there from Mr. Bhagwati, one of the consequences of the actions could be that there is a chilling effect as people try and digest and decode and decipher what this could mean for the global economy, what it could mean for their individual businesses, and fresh capacities perhaps may be put on hold. That could be an unintended consequence of these measures. Mr. Bhagwati, always a pleasure. Appreciate you joining us here on CNBC-TV18. Thanks very much for your time this morning. We will, of course, check back in with you as details emerge from the Trump administration on how they intend to take this forward.